James, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Always a pleasure talking to you. Middle Eastern states hedge their bets as they walk a tightrope in Ukraine.
Absolutely. I think what you're seeing is, and there was a hint of that already last night in President Biden's remarks with regard to Ukraine, when he said, one, that they were going to apply harsh sanctions which are extraterritorial, and two, that those who associate with Putin will be, the Russian president, will be seen to be associating with a pariah. So, with other words, I think that we're moving somewhere towards a Cold War situation where countries are going to be told, as George W. Bush said after 9/11, you're either with us or or against us. You're already seeing the Israelis who have tried to walk a fine line because they don't want the Russians to restrict them in their actions against Iran in Syria, now come out in a fairly forceful condemnation of the Russian invasion because they're not going to jeopardize their relationship with the United States. Those tough kind of decisions, or maybe are going to be also for countries like Saudi Arabia, which has a very close oil alliance in OPEC Plus with Russia, and of course the United Arab Emirates, which cooperates on multiple levels with the Russians, including having financed Russian mercenaries in Libya.
Now, sentiment among Middle Eastern youth seems to be shifting away from democracy towards Russia and China.
Indeed. So you have various public opinion surveys that are being conducted across the Middle East. One of those is the Arab Barometer, which is run partly out of Princeton University in the United States. And some of the top executives of Arab Barometer have looked at their surveys over the last 10 years. And what they saw in 2011, when you had the popular Arab revolts that toppled the leaders of Egypt, of Libya, of Yemen, and of Tunisia, that a vast majority of Arab youth looked at democracy and wanted political change and looked at democracy as the way forward and the kind of political system that they wanted. A decade later, for a variety of reasons, democracy is, of course, in crisis and hasn't delivered. It's been rolled back in counter-revolutionary moves. And there's been no economic progress. And, now with the crisis of democracy in the United States and in Europe, a lot of Arab youth are looking towards Russia and China, and they may not like the political system, but the political system, at least certainly in China, to a lesser degree in Russia, has delivered economically, and that for them is the bottom line.
Moving on to Turkey, the mayors of Istanbul and Ankara, Turkish President Erdogan's main challengers, have decided not to run in the next presidential election.
Indeed. So we are now 20 years into the political life of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, either as prime minister or as president. And in the last year, his numbers have not been looking very good. There's been a lot of, there's been economic turmoil. The Turkish lira has dropped considerably, and a lot of that turmoil, of course, there's been an economic downturn globally. We've had the pandemic, but Erdogan has idiosyncratic economic ideas and has, with regard to interest rates, among other things, and a lot of the blame for Turkey's economic problems are put on Erdogan's policy. So his numbers were not good. And for the first time, it looked like he could lose the next election, which is in 2023, if I'm not incorrect. And the polls show that the mayors of Istanbul and Ankara would, either of them would defeat Erdogan outright in a forthcoming election. Now those mayors have said they're not going to run for elections. They're going to focus on on their cities. And the reason for that is that the leader of their political party, the Republican People's Party, actually the party that was founded originally by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, that he's made clear that he wants to run for the election, and that must make Erdogan a very happy man, because the leader trails behind Erdogan, not in front of him in the current polls in Turkey.
Finally, then, Israel, a quick word on how food is dividing and uniting as much as it shapes identity.
Very much in a nutshell, food is, we identify through food, and we see food as shaping part of our identity and who we are. So what you're seeing in Israel is two things. One is the replacement of the food that came up from European Jews, with an emphasis on the food that comes from non-European Jews, so primarily Jews from the Middle East and from North Africa. And that, of course, it represents the demography of Israel. If you take Israel proper prior to 1967, if you take into account that Israeli Palestinians, that is to say, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, and Israeli Jews of non-European origin constitute at least 50% of the population. So on the one hand, you have Israel in terms of food becoming more Middle Eastern, if you wish. And on the other hand, there's a recognition by the Palestinians, first of all, by the Israelis and Palestinians, that their food is very similar, if not in a number of cases common. But two, on the part of the Palestinians, that they can't really, as with any cuisine, it's very difficult to trace the origins of a certain dish. And so Palestinians realize they can only go back a couple of generations, and that's where it starts to become hazy. So that, in terms of, if you think of a solution probably being a one-state, not a two-state solution, that fusion of food is an important contribution.
James, as always, thank you so much for your time. And we remind our listeners, you can check James' articles on his website, JamesDorsey.net. You can also subscribe via the website for his newsletter and blog.